There we go. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the conversation on autoethnography. And I would like to introduce myself. My name is Girish Daswani. My pronouns are he and him. And I am a settler living in Toronto, which is part of the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt, the Covenant, and home to many indigenous peoples, including the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It's also home to many diverse First Nations, Métis people, and Inuit peoples. I'm also an anthropologist at the University of Toronto, and I conduct my research in Ghana. For those of you who need to know, I'm a brown-skinned male with a beard, and I'm wearing a yellow batik shirt with some pattern on it. Just going to include a few more people as they come in. So welcome to the conversation on autoethnography. Each panelist will be introducing themselves, and they each have 5 to 7 minutes to share their views and their opinions on the subject matter. And we'll open up the conversation to you, our audience, once everyone has had a chance to speak. So once we invite you, feel free to let us know that you would like to share your opinions or to ask a question. We invite questions, but we ask that you keep them on topic and they remain concise and also courteous. So what I'll do now is I will begin by framing some of the broader questions that will allow the group to speak on the topic. And I won't take too much time. I want to try and also just open it up so that the rest of my colleagues can participate, and I'll come back at the end. So I want to start by saying that I do not as a whole dismiss the practice of autoethnography, in which personal experiences are interjected into ethnographic writing. One's suppositionalities, politics, and the critical self-reflexivity do matter. And unlike the assumption of objectivity or depersonalized narratives, basically autoethnography asks the readers to feel the truth of their stories. It's an approach that acknowledges and accommodates subjectivities, emotionality, and the researchers' participation on the research, and also their influence on the research. Now, so just this is to say that we're not here to trash autoethnography as a whole. We're here to clarify the possibilities and also the harm that it can do. So I want to start by saying that I understand while some academics we have to acknowledge that the practice goes beyond anthropology, that many non-anthropologists claim it as a part of what they do. I want to say that I understand why they choose to use autoethnography because you might, for those who come from or work with the members of their own communities or countries, it makes sense. And however, what I find startling and worrying is the absence of a critical reflection on the continued presence of colonial infrastructures and whiteness in some of this writing. Now, this conversation comes at a time when 2 publications, 2 articles have been the center of conversations on social media. And what we want to do today is to think about autoethnography as not completely bad, but how it can be a tool that reduces colonial harm rather than reproducing it. And so what I'll do, rather than dominate, just talk, I would like to open the conversation to my colleagues. And I'll start by passing the mic to Dr. Wunpini Mohammed.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're doing well. I'm so happy that you're all here with us today. And as you all know, in the past few months, there have been a series of publications that have come out that have utilized autoethnography in very interesting ways, many of which have reproduced coloniality in these sorts of ways of knowledge building. And before I even go into talking about this, I just want to discuss what research means in a lot of global South communities or marginalized communities. And when I say global South communities, I'm not just talking about, Africa, Asia, the Middle East, the Caribbean, Latin America, South America, but I'm also thinking about the global South within the global North here in the US, where we can think about indigenous communities and also Black and other racialized groups. And so as a scholar, before I even go into that, I should introduce myself. My name is Wunpini Fatimata Mohammed. I'm an assistant professor of global media at the University of Georgia. I am from Ghana, and a lot of my scholarship focuses on Ghana. So I look at media within the Ghanaian space, and I focus on how identity is sort of represented in media and all of that. And I have used autoethnography in my recent scholarship, and I will talk about that pretty soon. But as I think about research and what it means within our communities, especially in communities that have been harmed by scholarship, I'm thinking about communities that often think of it as, you know, a dirty word. So for example, Linda Tuhiwai-Smith says that in her study of her community and scholarship, she noticed that research was sort of seen as a dirty word. And of course, we know the roots of all of that and where all of that comes from. And I have used ethnography and autoethnography in my work in recent times. And I'm not an anthropologist. And one of the interesting things that I have noticed is that I come from a discipline that is relatively new. Media is relatively new compared to anthropology and sociology and all of the other disciplines. And so I feel like we have our legacy, of course, can reproduce, you know, coloniality in our work, but it's from a very different perspective. So I want to talk about how I conceptualize African feminist autoethnography, what that looks like for me, and how my positionality sort of informs the work that I do. And I'm going to share a little bit of work that I did recently. So for example, there's a paper that I published recently, which I'm going to share from, and I'll share it in the chat soon. So I have learned the importance of contextualizing my work in the history and present of my community and grounding my work in the epistemological resources available to do feminism as a scholar and as an activist. So my work as an autoethnographer, my work in autoethnography has sort of pulled from my experiences as a feminist activist and also as a scholar of feminism. And I do assert that African feminist autoethnography, which is what I describe the work that I do, how I describe the work that I do, focuses on the value of drawing on a scholar's experiences and community with knowledge co-creators while reflecting on these experiences and bringing new insights to the phenomena and the study. African feminist autoethnography also, for me, legitimizes the value of knowledge produced by Africans, which is guided by distinctly African feminist values. And this framework sort of validates the experiences of indigenous Africans and emphasizes the roles that we can play in building knowledge in our communities. So although canonical epistemologies have sort of postulated that a scholar should not insert themselves into their work in order to maintain objectivity, we all know that objectivity is socially constructed and that a scholar's research ultimately gets filtered through their perspective or positionality, whether or not they are actively detaching themselves from their work. And so besides the facade of objectivity, there is great value in grounding the action of theorizing in the lived reality of marginalized people. And so as I think about African feminist autoethnography, I believe that it can be a driver of decolonizing methodologies within my field. And for me, it is a framework that sort of creates room for a scholar to be self-reflexive while allowing them room for epistemological flexibility. And when I talk about scholars, I'm not just talking about people, those of us here, and many of us here in the room who do scholarship in the ivory tower. I'm thinking about people who contribute to knowledge production, irrespective of their educational background, whether or not they can speak English or Spanish or French, Portuguese, whether or not they have been published in these spaces that we're all familiar, many of us are familiar with. And therefore this perception or idea of who a scholar is sort of shifts attention away from seeing participants as objects of knowledge to co-creators of knowledge. And so for me, this is what autoethnography does. It allows for nuances to sort of be revealed. And so, and I think about a scholar as a member of the community who has not only contributed to sustaining epistemologies, but also works to contribute to its growth and pass on knowledge to older community members, to their peers, and to younger generations. And so by this definition, I think of my grandmother, my mama too, as a scholar, because of her contributions to gastronomy in my community. I think about my uncle, who's a farmer, as a scholar, knowledge producer, because of his contribution to ecology and agriculture and his farming practices. And I also think about Alhassan Yushao Jahanfo, who's a Dagonli news journalist, and Tamale as a scholar because of the way that he sort of co-creates knowledge in his community by, you know, conventionalizing certain vocabulary and news presentation and all of that. And so as I reflect on knowledge practices in my community, I taught myself to sort of unlearn the idea that valid knowledge is only produced in ivory towers and locked away in paywall journals, and that knowledge can only be decolonized if we re-examine who is considered a scholar or a knowledge producer. And so if we're moving away from thinking about autoethnography and its complicity with the reproduction of coloniality, we have to move away from thinking about community co-producers as knowledge as objects of knowledge production, rather than, you know, agents in knowledge building in their own communities. And so as I think about autoethnography, I've also learned that, you know, when we do epistemological flexibility, it's something that sort of allows you to not only be guided by your data when interpreting it, but to also sort of break away from the canon and conventions around theories and methods. And I believe that autoethnography, even beyond the baggage that it comes with, I believe that it sort of creates the opportunity for certain silenced histories and silenced narratives to be centered in ways that they have not historically been centered. So when I think about my work and the autoethnography work that I do, I think of my positionality as a Ghanaian woman, even within the Ghanaian scholarly and feminist space, and how that shapes the way that knowledge historically has been produced in these spaces. And so for me, when you think about autoethnography, we have to think about who is doing it and for what purpose that they're doing it and how it's even being done. And a lot of my autoethnography work have been reflections on the work that I have done in the community, without necessarily thinking of that work becoming scholarship eventually. So some of the reflections that I have done on my scholarship, especially in feminist organizing, I didn't go into that thinking, oh, I'm gonna do this work and then I'm gonna write about it. Eventually I just had to go back and reflect on that to sort of guide the work that I do. And I believe that, for example, if we are looking at autoethnography within the African feminist, using the African feminist lens, we are thinking about interrogating power and a scholar's situatedness within these axes of power and how that shapes the knowledge that is being produced. And I know that we'll probably get to this later, but one of the people who signed up for this program asked a question about whether we can use autoethnography to sort of interrogate racism in academia. So kind of scholar of color use that. And I have sort of done it, even though I probably didn't explicitly call it that, in a paper that I published last year, where I looked at media studies and my experiences as a graduate student and an early career scholar within the field of media studies. I definitely theorized my experiences in this academic space within the US context and brought attention to my experiences of racism and how white supremacy basically shaped a lot of my educational experiences within the graduate seminars and in conferences and my experiences in journal, in trying to publish papers in journals. And I believe that the book, Presumed Incompetent, is a very good book that shows how scholars of color sort of can use this tool, even if they don't clearly articulate that that's the tool that they're using to not only document their experiences of racism in academia, racism, sexism, and queerphobia in academia, but also how to show the way that our experiences, especially the experiences of marginalized people, are positions from which we can theorize. So we have to think about where you are positioned in sort of the theory making and process, and also your identity, right? A lot of the times we see people assert their positionality when they write papers, I am this, that, but we don't see that come through when they sort of try to share or when they do the theorizing or they do the analysis of their work. So I think I'll just end here and have the next speaker go on.
So who did we say was going to go next? Was it Dada? Or was it Kevin? Was it Dada? Okay. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. All right. So I'd just like to introduce myself first. My name is Dada Dokot, an assistant professor of anthropology at Purdue University and postdoctoral fellow at Tokyo College, the University of Tokyo. I am an anthropologist of the Philippines and the Filipino diaspora, which means that my field site is rooted at home and I follow migrant stories in their overseas destinations. I trace my roots in Bicol, Philippines, which residents call the Town of Dollars. This moniker links my hometown directly to the American colonization of the Philippines as the first US-bound mobilities of the people in my hometown in the early 20th century were through enlistment in the US Navy's racialized ranks. I acknowledge the privilege of being here in the diaspora today as the Philippines continues to be threatened by political violence and climate injustice. So next, I will be speaking briefly about what ethnography means to me and what kind of autoethnography I do as an anthropologist. I have learned a lot from the work of other autoethnographers who have used modes of writing which were not acceptable in the past to many of their peers. But in doing autoethnography, Sonia Riang has told us about the dilemma of the native. The native is often seen as too emotional, not too serious, or not rigorous enough. Geographer Kim England has also written about her discomfort with the power inherent in academic production, even for those who are intent on translating their academic work into political action. Donna Young has also written about how writing autoethnographically has led her to call anthropology an impolite discipline, as writing about an informant could lead to the falling out of our relationships with them. Meanwhile, sociologist Carolyn Ellis and anthropologist Ruth Bihar took a path to study others first before they felt equipped to study themselves. I am, of course, also inspired by many works by anthropologists who study communities that they're not part of. The list is long, but I am here to encourage students to trust and believe that studying their own community, however they define it, is a valid research. I was once told by an anthropologist that focusing on the Philippines would not be strategic to my career, as the Philippines was not a well-known field site, and that autoethnography is usually done later on in one's career when they are tenured. Such advice, I think, implies that othering is a rite of passage that must be taken on by the student anthropologist. I think some of us here might also be surprised that it is not necessarily the case, for example, in the Philippines, when we are encouraged to study our own communities. In fact, when I was a graduate student some years ago at the University of British Columbia, I attended the conference of the Philippines, and I sought the advice of a very well-known Filipino professor at an international conference. And I was so excited in telling them about my research based in our hometown, right? But this Filipino professor actually told me to not do that. And he was very quick to tell me to be kinder to myself. And they told me to switch to another field site if I can still do that, and perhaps study another island or perhaps an indigenous community. Natives often need to explain their location/positionality and their so-called biases, which makes me wonder if the same demand is asked of scholars visiting other places, even if they're not invited to study that community. It is important, I think, to contextualize these responses as a way of thinking about the fraught genealogies of knowledge production in formerly colonized countries or places, even if, especially if we were to consider the colonial approaches in our contribution to scholarship today. Negative impressions about autoethnography by scholars with privilege, and also by BIPOC scholars themselves, are linked with the colonial origins of anthropology and area studies. The mapping of field sites and our perceptions on who gets to write what and what forms of writing are acceptable and which aren't are linked to the ways that the field has been mapped by whiteness through certain forms of knowledge production. There are many ways to do autoethnography. Other scholars might find it fruitful in joining me in advocating for an anthropology that is rooted in the hometown. The hometown, I think, is a rich field site that exerts force in the research process because it is a space where our past, current, and future relations are grounded. Of course, I acknowledge that due to colonial dispossession, displacement, violence, trauma, and sometimes individual agency, some people may not have a home or may not have a place to call their own. But some may also find solidarity in doing anthropology at home or in the hometown. And I think autoethnography could not only be decolonial, but also empowering and healing. However, we also all know that studying home is not all warm and fuzzy and comforting, right? Filipino anthropologist Eflan de Hocano has once said that those who study their own community, quote, labor under a heavy psychological burden, end quote. I feel this very much. I agree that doing research at home demands attunement to relationships, whether consanguineal or ritual, and that we need to continually work very hard on these relationships for them to flourish. I'm also very inspired by the work of Indigenous scholar Sean Wilson, who suggested that research methods need to be constantly checked so that we are not just gaining in some abstract research pursuit, but that we are also fulfilling our ends of the research relationship. So it's not just like we are going to the field site with our, field tools, but we have to be constantly reminded that we have actually a relationship to also maintain. I think researchers of their own community know very well that these relationships pre-exist, and that while it's possible to fabricate new relationships in the field through ritual and expandable kinships, these are also very fluid, they require hard work, and they could also be disentangled and dissolved. To maintain these relations, sometimes the solution is actually not to do anything or not to write at all. I have reflected on what I have called negative production in an article some years ago in the journal Geohumanities. Negative production is essentially not doing something, but it is only perceived to be negative when we see production under academic metrics. What is productive in negative production, I think, is that the process of leading to not do opens a space into which we could roll back from individualized Western subjectivity to one that considers our relationships with others, and that makes us accountable to the people we work with and write about. I think that self-reflexivity in our work as post-colonial researchers includes being attentive to the ways that relations press upon our work, sometimes to the point of negative production or not doing anything. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dada. I'm going to pass the mic on to Kevin.
It's tough to follow. I'll try to offer some insights. Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin Asen. I am a PhD candidate from McGill University in Human Development in the Faculty of Education. I am not an anthropologist. I'm entering this conversation as, I suppose, a scholar of education and more broadly diaspora. My work broadly kind of touches upon questions around and curiosity around interdiasporic and queer relationality and kinship, grief and unworlding, and to also explore how young people kind of think about the future altogether as a collective and in collaboration, and perhaps what Robin D.G. Kelly terms as freedom dreaming. I have very scattered thoughts about today's topic, but I'll try to offer something that may give us some new departure points. And so just so everyone knows, I'm tuning in from Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, where I live and go to school, and that I have come to learn how to call home. And my offering today will be colored by all my scholarly interests. So perhaps it might not be useful for some, but I suppose some of us here can also think with me on some of these issues. I'm also pulling in a little bit of what Dr. Mohammed and Dr. Dokat has mentioned earlier about some of the issues in autoethnography. I have read some really great ones, and I've also read some terrible, terrible ones. And so I'm going to see how I can thread them together. But I do want to preface everything by one of the citations that Dr. Mohammed had provided earlier by Dr. Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, a Maori scholar, from her groundbreaking book in its 3rd edition as well, Decolonizing Methodologies, in which she has mentioned that research is a dirty word. But she has also written that research is never innocent, right? So I think that the powerful or the absoluteness of the word never, right, is important. And whoever comes at me with never say never, I don't believe that. I think there is a reason why she wrote never innocent. And that research is always then situated within a dynamic of power, whether or not we are from the community or not. So I think about from her work, and also from Lee Patel, who has written a lot about kind of shifting from in education research in particular, shifting from ownership of research to answerability. So the idea of accountability and answerability at the forefront of our research, of our work. And so similarly, in the context of autoethnography, I wonder how people are taking up these questions of accountability and answerability. I think about how autoethnography can also then become an invitation or a declaration to be held accountable as a researcher, and to make clear statements of how they are being answerable to the communities that they claim to serve. Kind of riffing off of Dr. Dakat's comments earlier about being in the diaspora and writing from the position of the diaspora. For many of us as diasporic folk, we enter our work with insurmountable amount of grief. And so autoethnography, I believe, can offer that space for us to mourn and grieve, and perhaps to even articulate epistemologies and theories that have no word for, right? I think a lot about what Dr. Mohammed had mentioned earlier about the kind of scholars that she considers, right? Those who are not necessarily recognized or will ever be recognized by the institution, but yet they are our teachers, and we have yet to learn so much from them. Learn and not extract, right? So I think that's a huge difference in terms of how we do things ethically. I'm very happy to and just honored to have been invited to be part of this conversation, and just wanted to give a shout out to Dr. Daswani for that. And I've come to this conversation through just kind of a comment that I made on the recent article published by Qualitative Research. And one of the most shocking thing for me was in the acknowledgement. I didn't really care for the article, but in the acknowledgement, and I'm coming from a position of graduate student, that's where it really kind of, my heart just dropped, because in the acknowledgement, the author had mentioned and had expressed gratitude to his mentors, his supervisors. And so I was left to wonder how many of those how many other scholars like him are out there? How many young emerging scholars are out there like him? And then just kind of thinking about that kind of intellectual genealogy and generations and generations of scholars that may take up coloniality as their project. I think a lot about how autoethnography as a form and a method of storytelling can also be invoked in the way that Sylvia Wynter has written about and talked about and argued about like humans as storytellers, right? Or humans as storytelling, in which then there's a way to reinscribe and repeat and rehearse the overrepresentation of capital M man, the white bourgeois. And so I think what's also important here is to consider when we think about positionality, or when we think about positionality, is to not only consider the idea of identity. Here I take up Stuart Hall's interjection around identity and his contention around identity, for it to not be individual or singular, right? That it is made up of multiplicities of histories and genealogies and culture. So here I then take up that interjection as a way to think about identity as relational. So I think there's something interesting about who are the relations within that writing, who are also in conversation with the author, the so-called auto, right? Yeah, I think that's all I have for now. But I'm looking forward to the conversation that follows. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. You raised a lot of good points, and so have our two other speakers as well. I think we're on the right path. Ruth, do you want to be next?
Through my sense in. Thank you very much for having me. It's a real privilege and pleasure to be on this panel and be invited as again, I'm not an anthropologist. I realize, in fact, the anthropologists are the beleaguered minority in the group. Some of you may know my work, but I guess I'm a political scientist, but I wouldn't use that term. I teach political theory mostly, but I do empirical work, and I've written a book on Nigerian Pentecostalism, which is also partly about method and about how to think about our research. And so I only gotten onto this autoethnography thing. I use the research methods of ethnographers. In other words, interviews, participant observation, basically hanging for years and years and years with my interlocutors and the people I was going to church with every day for, again, years and years. So you have to think endlessly about your positionality. So I'm coming here in this panel as the white, Western, Christian, bourgeois researcher, right? That's my subject position here in this conversation. And so my pronouns are she and her. So I'm the cishet, white, bourgeois researcher of Africa. And so that is a pretty loaded subject position, and therefore the onus or the responsibility on me is extremely high. So what really shocked me about my first encounter with autoethnography, and I will be here speaking in this critical vein that I'm known for, about what I consider to be the pernicious forms of it, because we've heard some extremely evocative and powerful accounts of how autoethnography is a form of giving voice to what we could call, subjugated knowledges or forms of knowledge, and deconstructing a colonial epistemological apparatus. So I'm all for that, but it all really depends on who is doing it and why, right? And so what I objected to was 2012, I was asked to review a paper for Anthropological Journal of Record, which shall remain nameless, and I was just outraged by the premise behind this person's autoethnography, which is really what I understood to be extremely self-involved. And I had some scathing remarks, the last paragraph of which I put on Twitter, and I won't revisit it here, but it struck me, and this again with the African Studies Review paper, which I'm a past author of it's a very complicated and field area studies under massive transformation, as they should have been, to try precisely to get out of the kind of colonial packaging of the world that gave rise to them and all of the science. So I'm always, in and out of these conversations, but I have to be clear, I don't write ethnography. I use it, but I was quite clear, and I got a lot of crap. Well, I got some criticisms from anthropologists about the fact that there weren't enough subjective voices of ordinary Africans in my book. And I had a lot of conversations with scholars about, what I thought I was doing, writing an account of subjectivation rather than trying to get into people's interiority. So, there are methodological questions we all have to handle depending on what our research is on. I was really looking at the outworking of Christian mission in the African context, right? And Pentecostalism is its latest iteration, if you like. But I do think that the problem originally, at least the problematic aspect in autoethnography, when it's deployed in the problematic ways we've seen that have caused these issues, the African studies issue in particular, is the question of, the problem of reflexivity again, which is dogged anthropology since it's, and I've actually made the case that really since writing culture at least, the need for and the problems of enacting self-reflexivity, this reflexive critical stance about one's own subpositionality within a colonial discipline, which is what anthropology starts out as, is really kind of all anthropology's been about, really. It's struggling to find an object, and this object becomes itself in a particularly interesting kind of way, and I would argue generative, right? I mean, let us be clear, as I like to be critical about anthropology, my co-disciplinarians are by far worse offenders when it comes to this kind of journey along the self-criticism and self-reflexivity, historicization, etc. So just putting that out there. I think while there's really an acute recognition of the way in which, for Western researchers, post-colonial alterity poses a problem that is epistemological, but also, and above all, I would say ethical-political. There's also really acute awareness of this, and I think autoethnography might be one, perhaps misguided and often, in certain cases, ways of trying to tackle it. So this ethical imperative, respect for the other in their integrity and their otherness, is absolutely correct, but it's much more fraught in anthropological practice, right? And it does say something about, I think, the origin story of how the problematic uses develop within anthropology. I don't think it's accidental, is my point. And I think as they travel beyond the kind of sphere and where these conversations have been had, and I can cite all of the Miles to Throop, Lambeck, Jackson, that book on Knowing How to Know. There's a lot of conversation in anthropology about how we know what we know, epistemological approaches, anthropological writing, much more attention to how we perform scholarly work, right, with respect for the interlocutors that we're working amongst. I still think, though, that there's a salvific ethos that's at work here, and the way in which anthropology has made this distinction on the grounds of cultural or alterity fundamental to its project, right? And Vivios de Castro puts it like this. He says, anthropology is a form of cogitation that, quote, assumes the virtual presence of another as its condition, indeed its precondition. And another there is capital A. So my problem with this, with the founding or the grounding assumption, whether it be epistemological or whether it be ethical political, right, of alterity as a ground, it's a very unstable distinction. It's not without risk, because really there's no way of studying difference as such, right? There's only different configurations of difference realized through different modes of differentiation. In other words, people and worldviews are always composed of various and diverse elements. How they parse out in terms of what anthropology identifies as alterity is a function of how is a question of how concepts function as processes of differentiation that are all, and these processes, something that I find lacking in a lot of this, are always embedded in relations of power, right? So, and then the other point about anthropological autoethnography, anthropological experiences, my experiences of others, are always mediated through language, and as such, right, set aside the institutional setting, expressed relations of power. This is something that Occidental autoethnography in Africa, I think, rather than addressing, fundamentally just displaces by placing once again the epistemological accent on the experiences of individual consciousnesses, with the white research being both the authorial subject and the medium for these subaltern consciousnesses. And this basically, to my mind, re-ups a kind of a modernist imperial fantasy, a fantasy of getting at the thing itself, through the exercise of an individual consciousness. And, you know, my point is we can never actually get at another person's consciousness. I can't even get at my own, never mind another person's, right? So the question then is, why is interiority, individual experience, and our experience of these experiences what matters the most, as it were, as a source for Occidental anthropologists, okay? And how much of this is about their own internal drama of encountering another or countering these other, as it is about trying to shed light or trying to, in a decolonial fashion, other ways of life, other ways of being. And that's my big open question. You could probably guess where I land on some of these. But I do think there is a case that there's a political lack of nerve, or perhaps a crisis of faith might be a better word for it, which is really connected to the discipline's complicities with mission Christianity, colonialism, and colonial science. And I think it's this history, the sense in which anthropologists understand it to be behind them, or at least struggle, all the various ways they struggle, as it were, to keep it behind them or to overcome it, you know, kind of that compel them to witness to the integrity of those cultural forms that colonial power set out to Christianize, civilize, and destroy. So I understand that. I've had endless briefs, though, about why can't there be more political reflection in your understanding of culture? I suppose I regret the demise of political anthropology to some degree, but I do think that the impulse behind it isn't an issue. It doesn't dispense us from ongoing attention to how this salvific or redemptive ethos is trying to play itself out in anthropological practices in ways that many anthropologists are not sufficiently aware of. How have I gone on too long? Do you want me to wrap it up? I just feel like that.
Yeah.
So I have to ask, right, whether this ethics of alterity, which seems to animate the idea of trying to get at this inscrutable, difficult other, this in a way that would be respectful and fully accounting for one's own political position, subject position, one's own relations of power. I think basically it's a fantasy. And I would re-up what Badiou says about the ethics of alterity. He said an ethics of alterity doesn't actually retain the real respect for this ethics that it claims to. What it really respects is difference as such, or qua difference, in its everyday form without the support, right, of an altogether other, which guarantees that the other isn't just a figment of my own fantasy or my own imagination or my own positing or witnessing. He says it bifurcates as soon as it's put into play. Any attitude towards any rigorously sustained difference is entirely different from the attitude it believes it to have towards difference as such. A rigorously sustained religious difference, fundamentalism. Rigorously sustained political difference, extremism. Rigorously sustained cultural difference, barbarism. This celebrated other is acceptable only if he's a good other, which is to say what exactly, if not the same as us. So this means really that in a lot of this anthropological discussion, the autos is the thing that has always driven it. And I worry about the kind of solipsism and the absurdity that is being reproduced. And my open question is, to end on this, is whether in struggling against these old modes of dominating, essentializing, and sublating difference, a grounding assumption of political equality is not a better place to begin axiomatically than a grounding assumption of cultural alterity.
Thanks, Ruth. Yeah, I mean, again, this is a conversation with open with questions that are open to everyone to also respond to. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just say a few words to bring a few threads that together. And then I want to open up the conversation to people who are in the audience. Now, I like to just say that, I mean, there have been so many amazing points raised by my colleagues in this conversation. And I like to just basically maybe touch on what Ruth was just saying about the idea of the fantasy, somehow by focusing on themselves or ourselves, ethnographers who work in the global south, which I consider to be the global majority, right? Because I mean, those of us who live or come from the global south are in the majority here, can also, those of us who work there can also project the fantasy of the self while avoiding questions of power and ongoing presence of colonialism in our work. The two recent examples in of the journals, the African Studies a Review Journal and the Qualitative Research Journal, raise questions about coloniality and about whiteness. So what is troubling in these examples is how autoethnography has been used to express the fantasies of white ethnographers who tend to speak for non-white people. And in doing so, they place themselves at the center of the ethnographic writing, the autoethnographic writing. They become the experts, the real experts. And they're here to teach people from the global majority and those who are doing research in the places that they actually come from or live or have somehow identify with. They come to teach people from the global majority how to use their own positionalities and experience to better understand themselves. If this sounds like a colonial project or at least the presence or the infrastructures of one, it is. So there's assumed entitlement and a colonial gaze, you can call it a soft colonialism, that extracts and colonizes the knowledge before giving it back. So now you can learn from us, which foregrounds whiteness. And by whiteness, I do not mean the color of one's skin. I mean the infrastructure, the structures of whiteness, which is definitely intersectional, where the global majority are talked about, but remain absent, and absent the presence without a voice. And Ruth was talking about writing a culture, which came out in 1986, which was credited by James Clifford and George Marcus. Bell Hooks wrote a response, a critical response in 1990, and in this book called A Yearning, Race, Gender, and Cultural Politics. And she writes, in response to writing culture, despite the new and different directions charted in this collection, it was disappointing that Black people were still being talked about, that we remain an absent presence without voice. And she goes on to say they give no attention to the anthropologists, the ethnographers in the US who are Black, who have been given, either been indigenous ethnographers or who have entered cultures where they resemble the people that they are studying or writing about. So in trying to give a voice to others and say, look, we want you here, we want to help you, they absolutely evacuated the book from any presence of non-white anthropologists who could speak to their own subjectivities and positionalities. And she also gives example of Zora Neale Hurston, who could have been, part of that book. So the real danger is not in using the method of autoethnography. It's really how the colonial infrastructures remain intact in many ways. So I'm going to just leave it at that. I'm going to open the conversation to those of you who have questions and to be a part of this conversation. If you want to drop your question in the chat box, you can do that. And you can also just raise your hand and say you want to ask a question. It's open now for anyone who wants to ask a question. In the meantime, I also invite my colleagues, if they have anything else to add to the conversation, to just go ahead and say what they want to say. I do believe that this conversation is important, not just because of the recent cases that we have been talking about on social media, but also about what it means to use autoethnography to hide behind a privilege that one does not reflect on, and then uses it to dominate a field that implies a colonial infrastructures that do not get questioned. So you can't claim to be decolonizing anything, all right? The word decolonization is a word that, again, to quote Eve Tuck and Wayne Young, it's not a metaphor, right? And unless you're actually doing the work of working with or on returning or giving back land, resources, and actually allowing the people themselves to distribute their own knowledge without you somehow being the expert, then we're not doing any kind of decolonizing here. So any questions? Let's see in the chat. Feel free to drop a question in the chat. Feel free to raise your hand. I may not see you if I can't see you for the very reason that there are many of you. Just turn on your mic and ask a question.
There is a question in the chat.
It's a question in the chat. Okay, I'll just read it out. Thank you. Very simple question. Is autoethnography not just another name for the instrumentalization of the anthropologist's reflexivity and critical assessment of positionality? Anyone else would like to go ahead and respond? Wunpini, Dada, Kevin, Ruth, anyone?
I'll try to take this one on. I think reducing it to that can be also limiting. I think there, when we talked about autoethnography as possibility and impossibility, I think a lot about how autoethnography as a powerful method or writing genre that, and I want to emphasize powerful in all its meanings, right? Both transformative and dangerous. So I think something about a mere reflection of critical assessment of positionality, I think it's more than that, right? I think it also offers up space to articulate things that the English language, and because we're all speaking in English today, that the English language cannot encompass. I think it offers space for us, as many of us are the other, right? Writing in that position, it allows us to also kind of grapple with some of the kind of grief that we're grappling with within the academy. I think also, I'm still sitting with that comment that I made earlier about the acknowledgement, right? Like that alone is, I could care less about the article itself, right? I just think a lot about the culture and the practice and the kinds of relationality that's being built within the context and desire of coloniality, right? I think that, to me, is the scary part. Autoethnography then just becomes a tool, then just becomes a weapon. But for many of us, it has been a safe haven, a place where we can potentially articulate something beautiful. And so I think also within our critique, it's important to kind of to see that, right? Perhaps some of us are endeavoring autoethnography without really calling it autoethnography. Perhaps some of us are we've been doing autoethnography forever, but we didn't know that it was called that. So I don't know, I just want to trouble some of the kind of logistical terms or tenets of what constitutes as a particular method or approach, and then kind of, not seeing borders or strict definitions of what things mean. But yeah, that's just a really long way to say, I don't know.
Okay, I agree with Kevin. I've done scholarship where I've written about communities. So for example, I've written about the queer community in Ghana, and I've also done the critical assessment of my positionality and how that shapes my interpretation of what I'm studying. But I've also, and I think that with that, I would say it's sort of like the critical reflexivity or positionality thing you talked about. But for me, and I agree with Kevin again about having done autoethnography without necessarily even thinking about it or thinking that that's what you're doing. So I'm just thinking about my entire journey into the academy and how I was a journalist before I came into academia, and how some of the papers that I have published were inspired by my experiences as a journalist in the newsroom, and how those experiences, like I sort of revisited those experiences to be able to further understand certain phenomena that I sort of observed while I was working as a journalist without necessarily thinking that I was eventually going to become an academic. So in that sense, I wouldn't say that I was just doing critical self-reflexivity, but I was definitely pulling from my experiences within that specific space to understand the phenomenon that I was trying to do. So another example that I'll use is that when I was home, when I went home to Ghana to collect data for my dissertation research, I didn't go home thinking that I was going to engage in certain, I just thought I was going to do like, focus group discussions and this and this and that. And then when I got home, based on my experiences, within the community and also speaking with people in the community and just being a community member, I had to sort of restructure the things that I wanted to, restructure the methodological tools that I wanted to use. And some of them were definitely informed by my experiences as a community member and how those helped me decide what could be the best approach to sort of building knowledge within this community. So I guess I'm saying that I feel like autoethnography takes it further than just being self-reflexive. But I also, one thing that I hope that we get to ask or discuss in this panel is also who can do it and how it looks like. Because for me, a lot of the autoethnography work that I have done have often been sort of reflecting on things, experiences that I have had and using those experiences to shape the work that I want to do. Because in that, the recent publication of the grad student, the European graduate student, it caused me to think about so many other things, about methodology. And as I saw the issue unfold on Twitter, I was thinking about a similar conversation that was being had around like investigative journalism and sort of manufacturing, conditions for people to be corrupt so that you can document. So it's something that I've been trying to grapple with because I really didn't understand what they were trying to do. And I definitely did not read that article and I don't intend to. Kevin, you're a braver person than I am. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not that long, but it's not also available anymore. They actually pulled it from the journal till they have sufficiently investigated the ethics behind it. I think there was no approval for the ethics, but I think it went through the review process. But we have more questions, so let's do that. And also, I just want to say that a lot of people who do autoethnography have good intentions. And there are many articles, and one in question in which we have also kind of discussed, had good intentions, but good intentions can also pave the road to hell. I mean, we do not need good intentions. What we need is people thinking through, being not just reflective, but also thinking about their own power positionalities, but also how they're reproducing a colonial infrastructure. So if we don't do that, one can be well-intentioned, but the goals are still very neo-colonial, which is not very helpful. Sana Malik asks, as someone doing fieldwork in my hometown, I'm interested in hearing from panelists doing fieldwork at home, how they think about the distinction between native ethnography and autoethnography, and what factors to consider when choosing to do autoethnography or not. Would anyone like to, those of you who are doing fieldwork at home, would like to answer this question?
May I? Yeah, I think the first thing to do when somebody's interested in investigating their hometown as field site, I think, is to find company, right? To find friends, to find books to read written by people studying their own communities. Because I think anthropology and most disciplines were founded on studying the other, right? And I think basically Anthropology 101 gaslights us into thinking that we are doing everything wrong because we're not doing the same as Malinowski or Margaret Mead, right? And it was much later on in my PhD program that I came to discover, work that I could relate to. And I was like, oh my God, where have all these works been, right? So I think it's very important to find reading groups, maybe professors and friends and authors who write about the same topic as you do, and to realize that how they write text is not as clean, not as clear as others do. These texts are actually full of hauntings, full of difficult texts. Sometimes there's a lot of trauma written into the text. And I think they're difficult to read, but I think we could relate more to this text than the other brand of anthropology. I'm not sure about the distinction between native ethnography and autoethnography, but yeah, I think I'm going to answer just the last part of the question.
I don't do this, but I think it's a great question. I want to see if anybody has other thoughts, because it strikes me that the questions we're looking at is, you know, who can do it and who should do it. And it strikes me that there we have a distinction already, autoethnography, which is general and doesn't really ask the question of the who and the why. It just is the autos, it's the self-reflexivity part that's being focused on. But it does matter who's doing it. It really does. And I think the native ethnographer, whatever you want to think about the term native, but let's just use it in its anodyne sense, is actually clear. It says, I'm from here and I'm doing ethnography from where I'm from. But again, this is really, again, subversive, right? Just that choice to say, because in principle, it's something you do for others. And one of the dramas junior anthropologists have found themselves in is some, you know, maybe this is 20 years ago or 15 years ago, but I remember speaking to junior colleagues who were freaking out because their topics were on things in the US. And of course, the others in the US are generally varieties of minorities or other disempowered populations, right? So if the anthropological object is always some form of disempowered group, then that should be foremost, even in what we call it, right? And I think that is maybe the distinction, because your question is correct. Like, it is a fabulous tool in the right hands, but those right hands, I think, are not personal or individual. They are structural, if you see what I'm saying. And I don't think someone like me, as well as I might learn how to walk, right? I lived 13 years in Africa. And one of the things they first told me when I got there is like, you don't know how to walk. I'm like, what do you mean? I don't know how to walk. I'm walking. That's not walking. I was apparently marching. Marching is not what you do on the streets of Lagos, which is, you know, the learning curve is lifelong. It's just that sense of entitlement, I think, that comes with the, you know, with the Occidental gaze is something that we just, it's bleeds into so much. So I do think making a distinction, as it were, between the native ethnographer, the person who is from the place or the culture, who doesn't have to begin that crazy long learning curve that I had to start, which is don't open the cooking pots, learn how to walk properly. The act of translating one's own life experience into another space, I think that's something that life expects from us, broadly speaking, but it requires a lot more from us, I would argue. And I like the idea of a native ethnography or a study of, you know, and if anthropology is going to be the study of culture more broadly rather than just the study of other cultures, then there has to be the pride of place given to the people who've been silenced and who've been just the objects of study, right?
Yeah.
So,
go ahead.
yeah, Sana, that's a very good question. I've never heard of native ethnography, and I don't like it. It sounds like going native. I don't know. It for me, it feels like it comes with this colonial baggage that it's messy. I don't like it. But my answer to the last part of your question about doing scholarship in your community, and I definitely agree with Ruth about how we tend to think about the authno, thinking about just the personal. But for me, when I did this kind of scholarship in my community, it was, you know, connecting to community members. And as you're doing your scholarship, my advice in your hometown, my advice would be to be accountable to your community. So for me, the scholarship that I do is often accessible to my community even before it's published. So when I go into a community and work with people, talk, you know, knowledge building, we have a meeting and then, you know, I share what my takeaways are, my major takeaways, and we have a discussion about it. So that way it doesn't feel like you're just going to talk about things that, you know, whether they don't know whether you got whatever you got there correctly or not. So just try and be accountable to your community in the work that you're doing. And for me, the autoethnography was also tied to the community because a lot of the things that I would ask were sort of memory based. So I would ask my mom when I was young, there was this film that was shown and I would like to learn more. Tell me a little bit more. Like I have these snippets of memories that I would like you and other community members to help me thread together. So there it becomes larger than that and it's become something that is built by the community. I hope that answers your question, Sana.
Thank you. We have more questions actually. And I was just thinking that, what about, before I ask the question, and you don't have to answer this, but then there are so many anthropologists, or some anthropologists, who've gone into fiction writing, who've actually, because they can't put everything into their ethnography. I know one anthropologist who they were writing their ethnography at the same time as writing a fictionalized account of their experiences. And both these books were published at the same time, one under a pseudonym and one under their real name. And the fictionalized novel was not actually fiction, was based on their own experiences with doing their research. And a lot of it had to do with romantic relationships with, someone in the field and so on. Or think about basically Amitav Ghosh, who wrote this book that we all cite and we all use, but it's really it's a work that was taken outside of anthropology to be able to talk about experiences that you maybe anthropology limited him in being able to do. The questions I'm going to just repeat. Is autoethnography just another name for the instrumentalization of the anthropologist's reflexive? I've already read this, haven't I? Okay, next question. Do you ultimately see autoethnography as something that reinscribes coloniality and systems of power? How do you work against the more negative uses of autoethnography in your scholarly production? I'm going to read one more and also give a question to Kagiso, who's got his hand up. There's also some overlap between autoethnography and what people in literary studies are calling autotheory. What's interesting is the change in scale that auto signals and how these various fields are moving away from the evental and the global through auto. So Kagiso, do you want to ask your question and maybe we can have a conversation?
Yeah, sure. Let me lower my hand. Let me show my face. Okay, cool. Hello.
Hello.
I'm joining you from SA, from South Africa, actually. And so I'm a PhD student, and I'm one of those people who's doing anthropology from home. So I currently stay in a township where I do my research. But I think the bigger question from my side is this idea of, I think, anthropology and ethnography as a whole, and ultimately this idea of obsession with doing, and which is a bit of an unfair sort of like ask, but this obsession with doing ethnography or fieldwork, right? In another country, in another community, especially for global North scholars, because this is an obsession, right? Which I think is so much rooted in coloniality. And the idea of you talking about autoethnography in Japan, I'm like, I don't get it, because you must be able to really connect yourself to sort of like the lady was saying, let me see your name, Dr. Mpini Mohammed. You're like, I would ask my mother, this question. So you're able to really, connect yourself. So how does a white man from Europe go all the way to Japan and do this autoethnographic study, right? Obviously, there's so many sort of like, questions to this in terms of how we define autoethnography and such. But I think the bigger question is this, how we are still sort of like, hell-bent on living our own countries. And by our, I don't mean me, I mean global North scholars, right? And they go and do it, and you see it in the North American Academy, the obsession with this. We need, there'll be a post or an associate professor or whatever. They'll be like, your region must be Africa and Southern Africa. Your region must be this and whatever. Because ultimately what happens is that a lot of this is imbued with so much power dynamics still today. And I think we ignore that so much, right? I reflect a lot on mine as a university educated person, Black person in South Africa who's been able to access. So I can sort of like, concede to my class, sort of like, class differential in terms of that, right? But ultimately, especially doing my fieldwork in my own community, I only have to sort of like, deal with that and, constantly, use the reflexive mind to think about sort of like how class plays a role. But a white person comes here, there's so many things they need to consider in terms of how that even plays out in terms of how they collect their data and how, their whiteness, their class, it could be even the gender or sexual expression or self-expression and all these other markers, right? They are so imbued with so much sort of power and become so complex. So I think for me, the bigger question is, how do we now start talking about anthropology, going forward? Because I think we don't want to, rattle that, because how dare we, change and, study anthropology, given what the canon and Malinowski and, company have defined on anthropology and how we've just taken that on. Why are we still obsessed with this idea of we must leave our country and go do, and then I know I'm babbling here, I'm sorry. And even this idea of sort of like how we never think that ultimately, you're not studying up, you're studying down, and therefore you're in power, especially as a global North scholar. So for me, I don't know if there's a question there, but I think it's something I want us to all think about. How are we still obsessed with doing anthropology somewhere? Because now we're getting a journal publishing a whole autoethnographic thing, about a man who came from Europe and went all the way to Japan to do an autoethnographic study. Nah, but yeah, that's not my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thanks, Sagika. So, what you raise is a question that I was like putting at the back burner, the question of actually doing ethnography. Because, the autoethnography is about the personal experiences and the subjectivities that go into the research of cultures and peoples and knowledges. But the ethnography part of it itself, we haven't even looked at it. I mean, the problems that you were speaking about with actually doing anthropology itself, it has been left untouched, and I'm happy to have that conversation. Let's hear from Edward before we have that whole conversation. Edward, you have a question?
Yeah, I actually was really interested because obviously the article that spawned this conversation was about masturbation, which I think is maybe something, I think for me, like my response to the article was that this person just talked about something that ethnographers have been doing for 130 years or however long it's been, right? And so I kind of, in a like tongue-in-cheek way, but also in a serious way, I do want to sort of like bring the sex to the forefront here, right? This was about sex. This was about desire. And I mean, ethnographers have desired their subjects forever. I think in the way that like missionaries desired souls, right? And so this is like a really old dynamic that I think really, really needs to be like pulled apart and like really thought about. And also like, I'm curious what the panel has to say about the erotic here, and not the way that the author uses the word erotic, which is a misinterpretation of how Lord thought of the erotic, right? It's just a gross misinterpretation. And so I'm like, how do we actually foreground the erotic? How do we actually foreground like bodies coming together? I think it was Professor Decolonizing mentioned like relation. Like, to me, it seems like this is not erotic, this is pornographic. And like, it's okay to talk about pornography. It's okay to talk about masturbation. It's okay to talk about sex. So like, how do we do that here? Like, how do we do that in our work? But also like in a way that's like not, I guess in a way that like, to me, I think the ethic here is to reduce harm, but also like, yeah, we do need to think about sex and power. We do need to think about those things. So I'll stop there, but yeah, thanks for your input so far. I've appreciated this conversation.
And that's what it is. It's a conversation. So I will open it up. Anyone would like to come in? Lots of questions. We can even go with whatever one has on their mind first.
I can say something. So I'm just going to try to answer whatever I can remember from all of the questions. And so I think there was a question about how do we potentially not reinscribe or reproduce coloniality in our work, or whether or not autoethnography is just another placeholder for the same, for that kind of production. And I think all methods are placeholders for any kind of production, right? You could do quantitative research and it could be decolonial, it could be very colonial. I think really, and how do we undo that is really in terms of as researchers or scholars, and I really hate to call myself a researcher because it's just so back to Linda Tuyi Smith, such a dirty word, not dirty in a sexual way, but dirty in a very kind of violent way. And I do think, and perhaps also a very sexual way too, right? I think, to Edward's comment earlier about the erotics, about what the desirability in terms of the other, how that is being understood and how that is being perceived. Or in this particular case, how East Asians are being perceived and understood. I think for me, as a graduate student, I've always struggled with the kind of literature that I'm being taught or I am forced to read and I'm forced to engage with. And it's only within my kind of PhD that I've started to venture off in other disciplines, right? And so I think the question for me, or maybe the task for myself, is to really kind of become undisciplined within my discipline. And so what it would mean for me to read across discipline, right? So for my first 2 years, I've only read not folks in sociology, but in Black studies, right? So in terms of thinking about Black studies as a more capacious entry point to all kinds of disciplines and how people are taking up questions around Blackness and otherness, but also coloniality within their quote home disciplines. So I've been pretty much informed by those interjections and interventions. So I think to answer that particular question, how do we then, not engage in that kind of reproductive routine, is to then pause, right, and see what others are saying, because I feel like even within this panel, many of us are not in the same discipline, but we're asking very similar questions. We're concerned about very similar things, right? And the fact of the matter is that even talking about methods, it's, many of us are asking questions about the method, right, or troubling the method itself, because it's also appearing and emerging in our own fields. And to kind of maybe just say a little bit about the whole erotic stuff. I think what's, for me, the most troubling reaction as I was reading the piece was that, and also kind of just my overall observation of what's circulating around Twitter and the reactions on Twitter, was that there was very little critique on Orientalism and what that would mean for myself to read something like that, right? Because as much as he was writing about himself and his exploration, his own sexual exploration, it didn't seem like it was about him, right? It felt like it was about, the other, and in that case, right, this kind of fetishization of Japanese, to be more specific. So I think also that's where the danger is, right, in terms of some of these so-called liberatory studies, right, like queer studies or whatnot, are entering these conversations doing the same thing. Because now I'm seeing, right, like, white queer scholars doing very similar harm than cishet, folks. So those are just my very scattered reactions and response to some of the questions here. Yeah, thank you.
Does anyone want to respond, or should we also take one more question before Wimpini?
One more question.
Okay, Victoria, you have your hand up. You want to ask a question as well? We can all come back to the whole conversation after you ask a question. Whose birds are those?
Mine. Sorry, mine.
No, yeah, it's true. You have a huge tree.
Actually, I'm about to do the thing that often white men do, where they say I have more of a comment than a question.
It's okay.
So So just to say first, I'll try to be incredibly brief. So just to say thank you for creating this space, all of the effort that went into putting this together. Thank you for lending your time. I want to thank in particular, there's been so many wonderful and rich comments and thoughtful comments made. I just want to, I think particularly what's resonated with me, and this is not to displace anybody else, but I think in particular just things that you've said, Wimpini, things that you've said, Kevin. And I think I just want to take up something that I think comes up a lot and sometimes gets not acknowledged, at least for me, which is all of the violence within this. I just want to highlight, and I think some of us know this, maybe many of us know this, but I think it becomes really easy to sort of like intellectualize these happenings, right? And so I just want to, I just want to encourage that we sort of take a step back and sit with this, the violence that we are discussing, and that is enacted upon us, right? I'm an Igbo diaspora, and my family is from Eastern Nigeria. I was born and raised in the US. I'm now in Northern England. I do research in Accra. I'm not a scholar of Africa. I do research. I've done research in Accra because I, for many years, had the opportunity to live in Accra and formed relationships. And so, for example, you know, Wumpini was one of the people that wrote this letter to African Studies Review, really critiquing this autoethnography article, this keywords article, And I just want to highlight, as someone who is, I'm an early career researcher, just sort of how violent all of this is, to sit and read this work, right? And I think this is something that Kevin mentioned, that some of us experience this in the reading of this and the having to discuss this, the ways in which places that we come from, places that our ancestors come from, places that our friends come from, et cetera, are fetishized, are abstracted, et cetera. So I just want to, maybe I'll just stop there, but just for us to sit with that. Do you know what I mean? Like, because it is quite violent. I just want us to, you know, I recently had to, I was asked to peer review something, and I work within the discipline of sort of like urban studies, geography. And a lot of what you're talking about, I think someone talked about this, you know, we're talking about different methods, but this is across many, many disciplines. And I was asked to peer review a piece of work where someone was using Black Studies scholarship, radical Black Studies scholarship, we'll say, right? And at one point, deep within the article, they talk about, oh, actually, they're not Black, which is okay. They're this ethnicity. And I just think, because someone had mentioned, you know, we're talking about Sylvia Wynter's work, we're talking about, you know, sort of, you know, these more capacious, these sort of like critical scholarly areas, you know, queer theory, Black studies. And even when we are using this, right? Even when we are embodying those identities from which these learnings have been shaped, we have to sit with, if I am not a Black scholar who is using Black studies scholarship, how do I sit within this critique, not just deploy it to write an interesting intellectual article? And so for me, this is part of what is also happening in terms of this autoethnography, and I don't do autoethnography, becomes also a means of doing this. But I think we get really talented as academics at deploying and using particular methods, but without actually doing, even when we're not even using autoethnography, this sort of self-reflection. What does it mean when I'm using Black studies? What does it mean when I'm a cis heterosexual woman who's drawing on queer theory? How do I sit within the violence of cis hetero patriarchy as I'm now deploying this theory, right? Or am I just ignoring that because I want to use Judith Butler? Do you know what I mean? So that's all in there, but thank you so much.
That's really, really good. I really appreciate your comments. And I think you speak truth. I mean, I think what you said is absolutely right. There is a lot of violence that we need to sit with. When I read both the articles that we mentioned in the beginning, I felt that I just felt completely uncomfortable, not just because of the sexuality or because of the speaking, they're speaking for me or speaking at me, but because of also the use of the scholarship that was just being used to further their own personal careers.
Yeah.
And what that means. Anyone else would like to add? Ruth?
I wanted this point because it was, Victoria, thank you very much for that. I think it's crucially important to recognize that this is about power and violence. It is. And that's kind of where I was hammering about. And the fact, we also have to look at the institutions, because, you know, the African Studies Review thing did not end as it ought to have, in my view. Wumpini and the other young African scholars took this in hand, and I was, you know, as someone who's published in that review and knows its history quite well, because I'm old, and has seen some of the trajectory changing, I was extremely disappointed. I was appalled and angry. I was angry because I could feel the violence. It's not directed at me, but I was just, God damn it, just furious. I was just furious. And there's, it's a form of perhaps impotence because, we all have to be, we don't have to be sacked, we have to be jeûné, to put it in the terms of Julio Batalha's, what's it? I've forgotten the translation of the title. Anyway, but there is a radical responsibility on the part of Western researchers. And I actually think, to be honest, I don't know if you remember the event that happened about 5 years or so ago when Third World Quarterly, remember that used to be the Marxist Review, published that guy who from wherever, God damn it, what was his name? Anyway, that one from that fasci dude who said colonialism was such a bad thing. And we were all like, whoa! So we have to ask questions. This is part of a broader infrastructure. I now mostly work on radical right-wing religious nutters in the United States not for the sake of my mental health. The Christians took me over somehow. But basically the enemy, if you like, the ones who are absolutely working against any of the values that people in this room care about at all. And so I do want to also flag the fact that this is part of a broader, much bigger, sort of moment that we're in, where the forces of repression and the forces of emancipation are the contradictions are deepening, and we all have to be even more vigilant, I believe, if we want to stand for these decolonial values, for the end of empire, as it were. I mean, maybe this is what it looks like when it crashes and burns. It's not going to be pretty, but I do think we're really looking at the rise of fascism in the West. And it's going to have effects on our institutions and on the journals and their willingness to take into account more radical, more emancipatory types of approaches and discourses, and giving voice to people who, are now going to be the object of all kinds of political discrimination and efforts, which we can see. I'm sorry I'm a bit obsessed with that, but I think it's important for us to attack at the institutional level, the way we wrote to the journals, the way we think about how we participate in these other institutional practices that are themselves, perhaps even rewarding this. Like, think of the clicks that guy's gotten, at least the paper's down. But I remember the Third World guy you wonder how much of this is not just cynically trying to get attention in an attention economy, which is even more revolting, to be quite frank. So those are some of the things I just wanted to flag. And I wanted to congratulate everybody who's been making these extraordinary efforts in that regard.
Ruth, I just want to add to that point. You know what? It seems like I want to go back to the kind of the ordinary ways in which academics control, or the academic gatekeepers who deny any kind of actual, through various stages of a review process of publication, of responding or not responding. In the case of the letter that Wimpini was one of the co-authors, they responded in a way that was basically protecting their own right to have published it without giving any acknowledgement of having done harm, and also then denying any responsibility, and also not. So my point being is that it is like the academics who we call our peers, who are maintaining and who are, the violence is being done by us,
Yes.
to us.
Yes.
And I think that's something that Wimpini, what was your experience in terms of having written the co-authored that, and then having to have read the response? Because the response to me was, unflattering.
I'm going through, like, you see all these like different facial expressions. It was horrible. It was as bad as you think it was. And I have just been sitting with Victoria's, request that we just sit down and trying to figure this out. And I feel like one of the things that we haven't really talked about here has been the material implications of these harms to actual human beings in the field, research subjects in the field. And I mean, it's fine. I guess it's okay that we are intellectualizing this and trying to figure out how to do things in ways that are not harmful. But I do think that a lot of actual human beings are, on the other side. And I don't think that we acknowledge that enough. And I also feel like it's because of academia's complicity in coloniality and this idea of extracting knowledge from a community and taking it away and all of that. And I'm going back to Edward's question, and I've been thinking about it. And Edward, to be honest, I don't have an answer to your question, but I was making connections between the Orientalist sort of gaze that that particular article was laced in, that project, whatever research project or whatever it was that was done, was shaped by. And I'm also thinking about how these white women, white American women, sort of, I don't know, exploited or took advantage of their relationships with African women to share. And you still see that sex is a common denominator in all of this, right? So like the guy was masturbating in Japan or wherever. I don't know if he did it in Japan. I was not interested in knowing all of that. So I didn't really read the abstract even properly. And then these women who marry African men and who take that as a license to be Africans by marriage. You know the word I'm trying to use, but Irish says that we cannot, we can't use foul language here. But yeah, I'm thinking about all of that, and I'm also connecting it back to what Victoria talked about with the fetishization, right? So like we're seeing all of this coloniality manifest in very interesting ways, and people, and all of the unethical things that happen on the field. And I'm also just realizing that, especially with ethnography and autoethnography and those specific kinds of scholarship, training in the global north, the training that we get in the global north does not equip us with the right tools to move in ethical ways in our scholarship in the global south specifically. And people are not held to account for whatever they do in the field over there, because that he would never have written an article. Where was he? I don't know what country. What country was he from? The one who did the thing.
He was a PhD student at the University of Manchester, but not in anthropology. It was one thing I like to point out is that anthropologists have been very quick to say, look, they're not anthropologists. So please don't come and,
Okay, we'll say he's a UK student.
But that's, yeah.
Yeah,
So
I don't
he would not have conducted that research in, say, a UK. I don't think that he would have done that in the UK.
He was in the UK.
No, but I'm saying that like,
oh yeah,
the object of study would not have been like a masturbation paper on like UK blah blah blah. When the reason why that happened is because the standards are often very low for us, right? We don't care about the global south. Whatever happens there doesn't matter. But if it's going to happen within the US, of course, there might be some scrutiny, but when it's elsewhere, we don't care. And that's one of the things that I've been sort of thinking about. But the experience with the African Studies Review Journal was horrible. A lot of us put our careers on the line. Actually, I wasn't even thinking about my career when I did that. But in hindsight, of course, we put our careers on the line by putting out that letter. We know that a lot of bridges were burned. And then there were a lot of senior scholars, some of whom were African, who pushed back and who tried to chastise us and who tried to make us feel that we were, we were attacking white women for doing good in our community. So I'm sorry, I'm going to end my rant here.
No, thank you for that. I mean, I think not everyone knows enough about both cases, but you can always do your own research. One is a publication in the African Studies Review Journal just a couple of months ago on autoethnography, and the more recent case is the one on by this European PhD candidate who is doing research on 2D comics that were about basically children, young boys, and he basically masturbated to them in his home as a form of autoethnography. Now, I want to stop there. It sounds horrible, and I just heard myself say that, and I don't think he liked it what he heard as well. So, any questions? I think we're almost past. We're definitely past the time that I promised people that we'd be going 4:40. I don't want to assume that everyone's got the time to stay. Any last words? I'll just let anyone on the my colleagues in the panel to say just maybe a last word before we say goodbye to everyone.
Just say goodbye to, I'm just saying goodbye to everyone. And I just wanted to say that as I was listening to everyone, I was really remembering Sarah Ahmed's work on phenomenology of whiteness. And I hope if you have not read that, to maybe take time to read it. And I was thinking about how whiteness really spreads and creeps into our lives and how whiteness now kind of found company like in empathy, in identity, in finding themselves as new minorities, as queer folk, or as marginalized women, but in the end ends up oppressing or inflicting harm on marginalized and minoritized scholars, right? And I'm thinking also about how a recent rejection of a paper that I submitted was because I was biased, because I was writing about migrants when I am a migrant myself. And then there's this article that gets released in a tier 1 journal in comparison to mine, which is about migrant workers living precarious lives in China. So this is really like anthropology, era studies are very harmful disciplines. And sometimes it's really, it's really difficult to keep on surviving in this fields. And we also have, I have received very odd reviews about, I suppose it's from a white male scholar who has told me in the review saying that, well, my wife does not think so. Because their wife is obviously like, they use their women of color partners sometimes to legitimate their own identity, right? So whiteness can be very harmful. And I think we have to keep on pushing back. So I'm really thankful for everyone for being here and for making space for us to speak together and with each other. Thank you.
Thanks, Dada. Kevin, want to add anything?
I'm just shocked by that last comment about the whole wife thing, but I wanted to thank everyone, to all the panelists here as well, for just holding space for me to be in conversation. I'm the only graduate student in this conversation, but also just the space in which I am understood and seen as and spoken to as a peer means a lot. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and mention it, and also to everyone who has asked brilliant questions that we haven't really gotten to fully answer, but yet still sit with and think about. And a huge shout out to Victoria's interjection earlier about just this pause that we need to be engaging in. And yeah, I think both examples were clear examples of how whiteness seeks to construct itself and mutate through this kind of construction of the other, right? Or kind of seeping into, as Dr. Dasmani has mentioned earlier. But I think these people have tried to embody, right, the other, quite literally try to consume them and manhandle them, right? So I think a lot about Bell Hooks's paper on eating the other. Yeah, so I just wanted to throw that in before we part ways.
So I want to say thank you for, if you want to read the comments in the chat, everyone's saying thank you to all of you, all of us. And I appreciate the group that we have here as well. Ruth, and then Wimpini, any last words, a few words before we depart?
I just want to thank y'all so much for inviting me to be part of this and allowing me to have my rants as well. And I'm just extremely heartened to have to, speaking as an old fogey, to see the younger generation. And I have a ton of faith in the future of, all of these fields that I've seen transform and morph over the course of my career. And I'm very hardened. But I just, again, vigilance and constant vigilance and apprehension. And all of us who are tenured here, we have one thing to be doing, and that is calling it out when we see it. It's really important. We're the only people around in this current world that has the freedom to say what we think and not get fired for it. So we should be using it, I think. I want to thank the younger scholars here for all of their efforts and all of the risks they're taking and all of the shit that they're having to endure. And I'm very sorry about that.
I concur. I would like to add my thanks to all the scholars here and all the participants in the conversation. Wunpini.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. I feel like I learned a lot, and it was also a little bit therapeutic for me. I got to vent, which is really cool. And I also just want to say to all of us that, you know, you have to keep pushing back. You have to keep fighting. For me, when I see something that's wrong, I feel like I have to speak up because I have a conscience. And, you know, some bridges may be burned, but you probably don't want to be in community with those people who do not see things the way that they should be seen anyway. So just keep pushing and keep fighting, and hopefully we can build towards a better future.
Thank you. I think a lot is in need of change. A lot of work has been done. I also want to say that I'm inspired by the scholars who share this space with me. I continue to learn from them and from you, those of you who are here in this conversation. And we have still ways to go, but I'm also basically encouraged by the fact that we are building communities through which we can work with and through. So thank you very much for your patience, for going and extending this conversation past the time that we expected or stipulated, and all my thanks.
And thanks to Catherine for supporting. Yes, I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, thanks to Catherine.
And this poster, and for the poster, which is
by the way, in case you didn't get it, was a naval orange, the navel gazing that we happen to do in anthropology and area studies, which it needs to stop. So thank you everyone again. This will be shared in a short time, and have a good evening or have a good day. Bye everyone.
Great rest of the summer before the crunch, everybody. Hang in there and enjoy some holidays.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, Dada.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Penny.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ruth. Bye.
Thanks, Girish.